Good evening and welcome to Teachers College. It's a wonderful occasion. I'm delighted to join you this afternoon to introduce Dr. Lin Goodwin, Evenden Professor of Education and Vice Dean of Teachers College. Lin and I have spent a lot of time together. Recently, we were in Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo last week with Mariana. I see back there, I know. So sad. So sad. But it was a really busy trip. So I give Lin a lot of credit for standing up here and doing this important lecture because we're wiped, right? It was flat out. And it was an issue, though, dear to her heart, and you'll hear more about today, international partnerships in education. So, it was wonderful to be able to travel with Lin. I can't talk about all the things Lin does here at TC because it would take up all her speaking time. So I just want to mention three things. On the international front, you know that thanks to Lin's efforts in 2012, TC and Singapore's National Institute of Education established a joint Master of Arts in Leadership and Educational Change, a degree program with a dual focus on instructional and curriculum leadership. So this is an outstanding program that operates out of NIE in Singapore. And it not only is innovative in its content and in its potential focus on the Asian region more broadly, but it's innovative for TC in that it's a joint degree program. And we hear everywhere we go interest in this kind of arrangement, so we certainly see the Singapore effort as a potential model. At home, Lin has secured about $18 million, I learned the right figure last week, in federal funding for our residency approach to teacher education, our effort to prepare future teachers in a setting where they apprentice under an experienced mentor teacher for a year, and also continue to learn here while they're doing that. It is an incredible effort that is also a model, and I think a wonderful opportunity for the students, not just for the preparing teachers, but for the students in the at-risk classrooms in which they're placed, who now have 2 adults in their classroom. So we're very, very proud of it, and we hope that the residency idea, as expensive as it is, will spread. Lin is, of course, also our Vice Dean for Teacher Education and is an instrumental part of our effort here to develop a special focus on preparing teacher educators, something I'm very excited about. I think that it capitalizes on TC's already important role in preparing teacher educators. After all, most of the people who prepare teachers elsewhere in the city are TC graduates, and to do it in a deliberate and strategic fashion will be a wonderful effort on our part. And I want to thank Lin and all her colleagues who are working on this. So, of course, Lin is also a brilliant scholar, and her 2011 book, Promoting Social Justice for Young Children, eloquently makes the case that between poverty, healthcare, and a public failure to safeguard their rights, children have become the most vulnerable subgroup in the United States. In another publication, a powerful study titled Growing Up Asian in America, Lin looks at the process of developing a sense of self and identity through the eyes of 9 Asian Americans who find themselves cast in the role of other. Out of this body of work, Lin has forged an approach to teacher education that's right in step with the needs of our time. And perhaps she put it best herself in an essay in TC Today magazine a few years ago. The teaching profession today, she wrote, is a dramatically altered landscape that poses daunting challenges, which include complex educational policies, the increasing diversity of all students, a world reshaped by globalization, and the imperative to assure that all students succeed. Against that backdrop, she argued, teaching today also demands that we speak out against practices that are harmful to children and hinder learning. We all need to step up, take responsibility, and make ethical choices for students and their families. Courage and advocacy are the extra qualities we look for at TC. They're what separate the teachers who merely know and do from our teachers who know and do the right thing. Lin Goodwin has walked that walk. Please join me now in welcoming her today.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, for that incredibly generous introduction. Thank you very, very much. It is, first of all, hi, everybody. Can't believe it's so wonderful to see so many friends, so many students, so many colleagues. I'm just really, really touched that all of you are here. It is certainly a great honor to be bestowed an endowed chair. So I do thank our president, our provost, the trustees, and of course the Evenden Foundation for acknowledging my work this way. But as wonderful as the chair itself is, the greatest honor is following in the footsteps of my teacher, doctoral advisor and sponsor, and friend, Professor Emerita Karen Zumwalt. Karen held the Evenden Foundation professorship until her retirement in 2013. And so for me, as her student, to succeed her in this important role is just sort of indescribable. I only hope to be able to mirror her commitment to teacher education and to keep pace even remotely with her contribution to the field. So thank you so much for being here. I would also like to introduce and embarrass family members who have kindly trekked here from out of town to support me. My aunt, Mrs. Ann Koo, and her daughter, Carolyn Koo. Thank you so much. The fact that you're here is wonderful. And I thank my husband, James Yap, who is always my biggest fan. Okay, so before I take up the whole talk time with thank yous, and I could really go on and on, let me begin. So when I look at the corpus of my work, I can see that much of what I've felt the need to know has been intimately tied to my own story and my perceptions of the world around me. These stories are not metaphorical, they're not symbolic, but instead emerge from my lived experiences and are concretely tied to my own assessments of teaching and teacher education that have led me to ponder silences, gaps, and absences. Essentially, my work has always been driven by this question: who or what is missing, and what should I do about it? So the very process of speaking what is not there awakens consciousness. We are made aware of diversities, multiplicities, and omittances. Once we recognize absence, we cannot help but re-examine presence. We see with new eyes, and we're reminded that what we know cannot be other than incomplete. This is not an accusation, but a simple fact. Knowledge is always partial and shaped by perspective, identities, contexts, and histories. We cannot be indicted for not knowing enough. We can only be faulted when our conscientization does not naturally compel us to dig deeper and ask different questions, to open up spaces so that those who have been mute and silent can speak themselves into existence. I did not always notice what was missing, but my consciousness was awakened when I arrived in the US from Singapore and discovered that actually I was the one who was missing. So in the space of a short plane ride, I moved from being someone who was active, a great participant in school. I like to be involved in everything. I still do. And someone who is very, very talkative. And in fact, I have, I wouldn't say fond memories, but certainly clear memories of detention, sweeping up the tuck shop, which was our canteen, because I had been caught yet again talking too much. But when I arrived in the US, suddenly that identity was completely gone. So the me that was somebody else, had disappeared. And in fact, I'd been assigned an identity that was silent, that was passive, and was strange. And, you know, I didn't realize how strange until I started to field some questions from my classmates. And, you know, the questions were about Singapore and about where I came from and who I was. And in the beginning, you know, they're fairly benign. So, like, where is Singapore? Do you live in houses? Do you have cars? Do you have electricity? And And, I was pretty patient. I said, yes, we have cars, we have roads, we actually do have lights. Yeah, television, we actually have television. But when the questions became more silly, that's a good enough word for now, when I was asked if we live in trees, and one day someone said, well, do you wear clothes? And I had it up to here. I said, no, we don't. So, of course, everyone was aghast. They said, well, how do you feel wearing clothes here? I said, I feel so constrained that the minute I get home, I just tear my clothes off, and I feel so free. I wonder when people realized that I was having a little bit of fun at their expense. Anyway, with my perspective sharpened, I soon realized that I was not the only person missing. There are actually lots of people missing besides me. When I decided to go into teaching, I was exposed to the idea of special education. It caused me to think about my schooling in Singapore and the realization that students with disabilities were completely absent. They were missing from the educational equation entirely. It caused me to ask questions about access to education and how we decide who is worthy of the investment, who belongs and is invited into learning, and who is kept outside. It also made me think about wasted capacity and how much is lost when diverse people are missing from the classroom and from the curriculum. We all have stories from our own lives, from our own families, about unrealized potential. And my story is about my sister. So my sister Carol used to live in San Francisco, and I would on occasion go to visit her. And she was a great trawler of secondhand stores, and so I was with her one day, trawling through the clothes, and she pulled out a little taffeta petticoat, sort of, madras print, jewel colors, and I'm going to step over here for a second, because she handed it to me, and she said, isn't this pretty? And I stood in front of a mirror, and I held it up as one would a petticoat, and I said, yeah, that looks really sweet. I handed it back to her. She put it on, and she wore it here. Then she shimmied it down her hips to see how that would look. Then she decided to put it all the way down to her knees to see what effect that would have. Then she pulled it up to her chest, so it became sort of like a little top. Then she took it off entirely and wore it like, a crossing guard banner. And then she took it and put it around her head so that the elastic framed her face and the petticoat kind of stood out like headgear. And I said to myself, here is someone who never colored within the lines, ever. If there was alternative, that was my sister. And of course, she was someone who was a constant irritant to teachers because she always wanted to do something different. She always had a different idea. She had too many questions that started with why and why not. And of course, school ended up being a very unhappy experience for her. In fact, I remember her coming home with a test result, and she got 2 points out of 100. And my mother said, 2 points? You got that for putting your name on the paper. So my mother was quite disappointed. But anyway, needless to say, my sister was clearly invisible in school. And as a result, even though she is now a very, very grown woman, she continues today to doubt her abilities and question her worth. So you can see why my preoccupation with missing is very personal, because it is the personal that invariably frames our professional choices. So tonight, I would like to share with you two abridged tales of missing that represent my current work. So one is about the teaching of teacher educators that Susan mentioned, and one is about the teaching of teachers. And there is an international connection here, which I will share with you later. The description of my talk says that these two studies bear on the future of education worldwide. I did not write those words. They're kind of big and dramatic. So I don't know if they will bear on worldwide education, but I will say that it does seem that when things are recognized as missing, then it dramatically changes what you do and think. So here we go. So the first tale is the tale of missing teacher educators. So we all know that we are preoccupied as a world, as a global community, with this idea of quality teachers, what it looks like, how to get it, what qualities a quality teacher has, so on and so forth. And there isn't, I would say, any place in the world, although I've not been to every place in the world, I will admit, but I have been to some really interesting places. And from Mongolia to Latvia to Brazil to Singapore, everyone is asking the same question and being very concerned about this. But I noticed that in this whole conversation, there was something missing, and that is teacher educators. It goes, the equation is actually pretty simple. If teacher educators are the ones who prepare quality teachers, then we would expect that we need quality teacher educators to do that work. But I knew from my own experience, and I was lucky enough to apprentice in a great teacher education program, that there was really no such thing as preparation for teacher educators. So colleagues and I embarked on a study because we needed to ask that question. Where are they? What do they think? And how are they prepared, if at all? So my colleagues, I think Laura is here. Hi, Laura and Mariana. Hello. Thank you. Mariana Sotomayor and Laura Smith, my two colleagues and partners in this research, decided that we needed to ask current practicing teacher educators three things. And that was basically, what do they think is foundational to their practice? How do they evaluate their own preparation in this? And what can they tell us that would help us learn about what to do next? So we conducted a mixed method study using a convergent parallel design where we had sort of a quantitative phase and a qualitative phase. Both sets of data were collected separately. They were analyzed separately by different members of the team according to our, sort of methodological expertise. And then we brought those findings together as a way of sort of confirming what we learned from each set. So first, the quantitative part. We had an online survey. We actually had a very, very good response, but ended up with 293 surveys that were complete. And as you can see from the demographics, the group was mostly white, they're mostly female, they mostly live in the US, and they brought a great deal of experience, or had a great deal of experience in education. They self-identified as teacher educators, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means later on. They had completed doctorates over a very, very long span of time, between 1974 and 2001. But what we discovered when we looked more closely is they kind of fell into two pretty even groups, with half having completed their doctorates before 2006, and the other half having completed their doctorates between 2006 and 2011. So a fairly substantial half the group number who had completed their work fairly recently. Most of them were either tenured or in a tenure track position, and very, very few of them had a degree of any kind, a doctorate that was connected to teacher ed. We asked them how they spent their time, and what we saw is that they spend most of their time teaching. And in fact, the average course load was 5 courses, but the range was actually 0 to 10. Can you imagine teaching 10 courses a year? Most of them, 2/3 of them, work in institutions that have either a low or moderate emphasis on research. So only a very small percentage work in institutions that would be called research intensive. So our survey was a 45-item survey using a 5-point Likert scale. And there were 7 domains of knowledge. And what we did was we created an 8th domain, a multicultural subscale, because we decided that we didn't want to have sort of one clump of diversity multicultural questions, but we wanted to integrate them throughout. And it was a pretty simple survey. We just said, look at these items and tell us, are they important to your work, and how well prepared were you to do them? So overall, they gave favorable ratings to just about everything. Everything was important. Everything helped in their preparation, in their work. And they felt, reasonably prepared. There were no, major significant differences between groups, but there was one huge difference that we noticed. And this was around the issue of diversity. And what we found in response to Merrifield's question about today's teacher educators and whether they are prepared to kind of work with diversity and work in diversity is that practicing teacher educators, at least in this sample, didn't feel prepared. They didn't feel very comfortable doing work in diversity. And in fact, what we did see was that the more experienced teacher educators actually ranked multicultural issues less highly than those who were less experienced. So what did that tell us? That senior faculty who probably had more time to have an impact on the curriculum of pre-service students were feeling ambivalent about their ability to engage around issues of diversity. Second, these senior faculty were probably mentoring, either formally or informally, their more junior colleagues. So we asked ourselves, what could folks be teaching, whether implicitly or explicitly, their junior colleagues about diversity issues? We then conducted an interview. At the end of the survey, people were invited to participate, and we actually got 126 volunteers. I know, it was really wow. And there's no way that we could interview so many people because we would still be interviewing now if we had done so. So we decided that we would aim for about 10% of the sample. And we sampled 20 people to participate in the interview, and you can see some of the demographic data there that's more or less mirror kind of the predominance of white faculty in teacher education, the balance between male and female. And what we saw was that most of the group had completed their doctorates more recently, and 5 of them said they specifically chose to go to get their doctorate in order to focus on teacher education. So we basically analyzed our data around the 3 questions around preparation, foundation elements, and recommendations. But because of time, I'm simply going to focus on one, and that is, what did they say about their preparation? It was not a pretty picture. So first of all, 3/4 of them fell into the profession. And what that meant was there was a job. I didn't intend to go into teacher ed, but I needed employment, so that's where I went. Or they talked about happenstance, that it just so happened, that I ended up in teacher ed. That was a problem. There were significant inconsistencies in their experiences as doctoral students. The operative word here was luck or lucky. So people said, I was lucky to have a great advisor. I was in the right place at the right time. I was just really fortunate that I was assigned to someone who, really looked out for, my growth and my development. And folks also talked about their peers and how they saw peers who did not have the rich experiences that they had. Or they talked about themselves and about how they didn't have the rich experiences that other people had. So that was a problem. There was definitely no explicit development around teaching or pedagogy. So the entire focus was on research, but a complete separation of research and its relationship, perhaps, to teacher education. Now, of course, we only interviewed 20 people, so it's hard to know if those responses have any meaning across the entire sample. And so what we did was we conducted a post-hoc examination of the quantitative data to see if the 3 major themes around lack of preparation for teaching, lack of preparation for the profession, and also an emphasis on research, but more so an emphasis on using research than doing research. And that post-hoc analysis enabled us to confirm those themes across the larger sample. So that was very exciting for us to see. So what does this study tell us? Well, first of all, clearly, too many people are being hired to do teacher education, and they are not prepared for it, they are not qualified to do it, and many of them don't even choose to do it. So it's not surprising that people step away from teacher preparation work as quickly as they can because it is labor intensive and it is low status. Now, if you look at the research, and it's limited on the preparation of teacher educators, and most of it actually is international research, not research here, we're just starting to get into that groove, it's clear that being a teacher educator is not a 2-step process, even though it's treated as one. So you can't simply take your teaching experience, if you have it, and then translate it to teaching adults, because the 2 things just don't fit. But at the same time, we in the profession, us in the academy, perpetuate this by continuing to hire folks who don't have any preparation, maybe don't even have teaching experience, and we look simply for discipline specialists. The third is that this lack of preparation results in teacher educators who do what? They teach as they were taught. So we heard stories about teacher educators reaching far back, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, into their own teacher preparation. Talk about replicating history and not moving forward. And those who had never taught before, what did they do? Well, they looked to their teachers. So, you're moving even further back. People also talked about the fact that there were no models in the university. And in fact, I remember one story from one respondent who said, it was kind of, wild listening to one of my senior colleagues lecturing about not to lecture. So, yeah, they were told what to do, but they were not able to learn how to do that. So what's happening is that teacher educators are not doing the work they were prepared to do, which is research. Most of the teacher educators in this group were higher users of research. They were not producers of research or knowledge. And in fact, many of them talked about the research that they did in ways that were very curious, I think just trying to make that link. And what we discovered is that people talked about accreditation work and report writing as research. So using their research skills for other things that they needed to do in the university. So on the one hand, they're trained to be researchers, but they're not doing that work. On the other hand, they're not trained to be teachers, and they're absolutely doing that work. Remember, going back to the original sort of demographics of the sample, 2/3 of them were in institutions with a low to moderate emphasis on research. So, if teacher educators are not well prepared, if teacher education work has low status in the institution, is it any wonder that we are being bashed and banged about by poor, teacher preparation programs, because we have no option without preparation to do something that is thoughtful, that is innovative, and that is perhaps research-based. So that is Tale of Missing, number 1. So Tale of Missing number 2 is about the preparation of teachers, and it is an examination, a search for meaningful international lessons. And I say meaningful because right now, in this era of globalization, it is possible for us, amazingly, Susan and I were in Brazil 5 seconds ago, having amazing conversations with folks about all the issues that all of us are familiar with in terms of teacher preparation, in terms of quality, in terms of schooling, in terms of access, in terms of achievement gaps. The list goes on. So the conversation is not only the same, but it can happen in real time across nations. It is phenomenal. But what it means is that that phenomenon allows us to kind of pick and choose very superficially what other people seem to be doing. So we don't have deep knowledge, we don't have rich knowledge, we don't have substantive understandings of what is really happening in so-called high-performing nations. And so what we do is we look simply at the surface. And sometimes what is being picked is not from high-performing nations, but it sounds like a good idea. So in Brazil, we talked to someone who told us about a governor in a state who wants every school in the state to be a charter school. Why? No evidence, but it's a case of kind of cherry-picking something for some particular reason. So in this whole conversation about international high-performing nations, we have to move beyond the surface and the superficial to dig deeper into what is meaningful about the work that they do. So I am fortunate enough to, one part of my work is to be part of an international comparative study of teacher quality, looking at 8 jurisdictions. And we call them jurisdictions because some are states, some are cities, and some are countries. And I'm going to use Singapore as the case because I am on the Singapore team. Now, I'm here to tell you that even though I'm from Singapore originally, and my mother and my stepfather and my sister, they're all there, and I have all my childhood friends there, and some of my best memories are from Singapore. And I do have lots of professional friends now because of all the collaborations we have. I am here to say that I can be completely objective when I'm speaking about Singapore. So here's a map of Southeast Asia with the red dot, and Singaporeans often call themselves, or their country, the red dot, because we're so tiny that that is what is used to represent us. And it would be remiss of me to not mention that, first of all, Singapore is 50 years old this year in terms of independence, and we are very, very sad to have lost our founding prime minister who just passed away on Monday. So Lee Kuan Yew, a lot of people loved him, a lot of people hated him. He was never a person who was not attached to controversy. But undoubtedly, he loved Singapore deeply, and everything he did was for the country. And so his legacy really is what we're going to talk about today. So this is a picture of Singapore from the 60s, and it's a picture I know well, because it's actually a Singapore that I grew up with. And that is the Singapore River. And in fact, when I was growing up, and also as a high school student, there was one bridge. Now there are many bridges, but there was one bridge over the Singapore River, and we would run over it without, holding our noses, because the river was not water; it was sludge. It was horrible. And what you see in the distance there is the clock tower for Victoria Theatre, which is one of the oldest theaters in Singapore, and at the time, one of the tallest points on the island. So this Singapore, I will tell you, was not known for good schools. It was not known for good teachers, and nobody was talking about our high performance. Schools were horrible. Teachers were 5 minutes ahead of their students, not just in terms of preparation or in terms of subject matter knowledge, but also in terms of age. So this is Singapore today, and this is in the space of a generation. So that generation is mine. I'm standing in front of you as the generation where Singapore has really been transformed from something that was very far from 21st century. And we're very, very proud of our PISA results. And so we have this big PISA flag that's flying. I put it in there. I'm just kidding. I was just kidding. I thought it was cute. Actually, nobody talks about PISA in Singapore. Folks are anxious to find out what the scores are. And once the scores are out, business moves on. But here you see Victoria Theatre again. So that gives you a little bit of perspective about how much, the city has grown. So before I begin the story of Singapore, I want to talk a little bit about the context, because there are many sort of misconceptions about what Singapore is or what kind of environment is involved. Singapore has about 5.5 million people, and it's growing. We have a large immigrant population. In fact, all of us in Singapore were immigrants for the most part. It is multiracial, it is multi-religious, and it's multi-ethnic. We have about 500,000 students, and of those 500,000, close to half of them do not speak English as a home language, even though the instruction in Singapore is in English, but we have a strong bilingual policy. There are 33,000 teachers, and they teach in about 350 schools. So something happened along the way to change Singapore from that no good schools, no good teachers, and no performance to write home about, to this sort of high-performing powerhouse that it is today. And it wasn't by chance, and it wasn't overnight. So two very important things happened. One was in 1997, the Prime Minister at the time, Goh Chok Tong, gave a speech, and he talked about thinking schools, learning nation. That is what his vision was for Singapore. And that started an era of reform, and I hate to even use the word reform, but it was about progress and movement and development and attention to not just education, but to teachers. In 2005, our current Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, talked about, he sort of extended the vision of Thinking Schools, Learning Nation to now include Teach Less, Learn More, and that was about moving away from sort of a focus on content and subject matter knowledge to the idea of thinking and more space in the curriculum. But what's most important are the two things that these leaders said, and both those things are about teachers. That teachers need to be learners too, that schools needed to be good places for teachers, and that teachers were professionals. As a consequence of these actions, starting in 1997, teaching is now seen as a very, very desirable profession. And so, and it's desirable for lots of reasons. So first of all, teachers are almost revered as nation builders. And this is something that is part of the rhetoric, always, all the time. And the second is that they're thought of as thinking professionals. They're not functionaries. Third, teaching is considered a fraternity, and so folks talk about the community and the family that they join as teachers. And finally, teaching is seen as a respected and very viable career. One of the teachers whom we interviewed as part of this study said very clearly, "I always wanted to be a teacher, but teaching was not considered to be an attractive career. It was low status and poorly paid. And I knew, as a college graduate, that that was not necessarily the work that I would choose. Plus, I worried about being able to support a family." In 1997, when the salaries changed and everything changed for teachers, he joined the teaching fraternity and is still teaching today. So when teachers are seen as valuable, it's almost like a mobile. You touch value and everything else changes, whether you're talking about recruitment, compensation, qualifications, work life, professional development. I don't have enough time in this talk to go through all the many things that are in place in Singapore. I'm happy to talk at length to anyone who's interested. But there's also lots written about all the various programs and strategies and advancements that are available. But I'll give you a couple of snippets. Compensation. In 1997, going back to that kind of hallmark or watershed year, teacher salaries were changed to be commensurate with other professions that required the same education, i.e. lawyers, engineers, and accountants. So that dramatically shifted things overnight. The second thing is that if you plan to be a teacher in Singapore, your entire education is paid for. I know this is hard for folks at TC to hear because, yes, we wish we could do it. But not only is your education paid for, you are actually hired as an employee of the Ministry of Education from day one, and you receive a salary, along with benefits and other materials and a laptop and Entry and induction. There is a well-defined mentoring and induction program because the expectation is not that a new teacher is able to mimic or perform the same way a veteran teacher might. So new teachers have a reduced workload. New teachers actually take some additional courses almost immediately on what? Working with parents, classroom management, the things that are always troublesome for new teachers. There is no expectation that they are going to be perfect. Conversely, the expectation is that their learning will continue for a very, very long time. So there's always a lot of naysaying, when we talk about high-performing systems. When we talk about Finland, or we talk about Shanghai, or we talk about Singapore, because people will say, well, we're different here. So we're too big, we're too small, we're too diverse, we're not diverse enough, we're too poor, we're too rich. I mean, the examples and the sort of excuses go on and on. So my message today is to say, okay, perhaps we can't pay for everyone's education and hire them as employees of the Department of Ed tomorrow. But I think that there are some sort of large lessons that actually transcend, cultural differences, location, national traditions, etc. So I have two sets of lessons. The first lesson is a moral one, or at least a set of moral lessons. So in Singapore, from the time I was growing up all the way through now, the message has always been people are our business. They are our most precious resource. Now, it's very, very natural for Singapore to say that because we're a teeny little island. We don't have minerals or oil. We don't even have good beaches. You think that we would, but we actually don't have good beaches. So there are lots of things that we don't have in order to move forward. So what do we do then? We placed all our bets on human beings. And so there's no child who can be wasted. And also, there's no teacher who can be wasted. So the current focus, Singapore is a land of slogans, and the slogan now is every child, every student, an engaged learner, with focus on being student-centered and also values-based. For teachers, going back to my conversation before about no expectation that you'll be ready on day one, it is about staying in with teachers over the long run and working with them and developing them over time. The stance in the country, and the stance actually in countries that are high-performing, is about learning, not blaming. So no one is pointing fingers and saying, you're at fault, it must be you. Instead, what they're saying is, how can we get better, and what can we learn from what we're doing in order to make that improvement? Singapore collects data like, it's out of style. They have data on tests and on kids and on teachers and on just about everything you can imagine. But those data are never used to punish teachers. They are never used to call schools out, and no school is closed as a result. Those data are used. Yeah, I think that deserves a clap. Those data are used to learn, not ever to blame. And finally, it might be easy to say, well, isn't that isn't that idealism? It's not realistic. Singapore is absolutely very realistic. It's a very pragmatic mission because they understand that their future depends on everybody being well educated. Second set of lessons are professional ones. And so let me just kind of go through them very quickly. But the most important, which we have already heard, is that teachers are professionals and they are to be treated as such. So, for instance, right now, Singapore is moving towards graduate level or post-baccalaureate preparation. 2/3 of teachers are already prepared at that level, and the intention is to go further. Teachers are engaged and consulted on decisions that matter to them. So when I was in Singapore 2 years ago on sabbatical, in September, the Minister of Education does a big speech and offers kind of the work plan, the goals for the year. And then what happens after that is that there's actually a nationwide conversation where groups of people that meet, bringing together teachers and community members and parents and what have you, and they debate the work plan and give feedback to the ministry. How cool is that? So the fact that your voice actually matters is sort of amazing. The second is that higher education and further study matters. Now, there's a lot of controversy in the U.S. and a lot of folks who say there is no evidence that having more education or having a master's degree actually makes a difference in terms of student learning. But the fact is that sometimes you don't need evidence in order to say something is a good thing to do. Professionals are professionals because they are engaged in lifelong advancement, improvement, and learning. And some of that learning will happen in a formal sense, a lot of it, at universities such as this. So Singapore doesn't need evidence that it matters to student test scores, because what they're saying is that teachers as professionals, just like other professionals, need to be engaged in furthering their knowledge. The third is that professionals require opportunities for growth and advancement, real opportunities, not merit pay schemes that say if you get 3 points more on the test, you'll get $500. But meaningful career ladders that teachers can decide to follow according to where they think their strengths are. So to give you one example, in Singapore, the career ladder has 3 tracks. There's a teaching track for those who are very invested in developing and advancing as master teachers. There is an administrative track, and that is for those who are interested in administration, not teacher leadership, but administration in the more traditional sense, to be principals or to work in the ministry. And the third is a specialist track. If you love your subject and you really want to go deep into, art, then that is the opportunity for you to engage in that deep work and advance yourself professionally. teachers also get, all kinds of support to study abroad, to do internships, to go back to school. There are wellness programs, and there is an academy of Singapore teachers that is started by teachers, run by teachers, and is for teachers. And that is part of one of the mechanisms that is in place to engage teachers in decision making. And finally, there is a very, very strong sentiment, very, very strong insistence that if teachers are professionals, then they are also knowledge producers. They don't simply use knowledge. And so teachers as researchers is very, very strongly supported, so much so that time is actually built into the calendar so that teachers can meet together, not just to do research, but to engage in co-planning or to work on curriculum or what have you. But most teachers and growing numbers are engaged in action research, in lesson study, and in professional learning communities. So, what does this all mean for us? Are there things that we ought to unlearn? Maybe there are things that we ought to relearn. And certainly there are things that we need to do in order to reform rather than engage in some of the deform that scholars such as Viv Ellis and Marilyn Cochran-Smith and Ken Zeichner have talked about. So one lesson that we really need to relearn is schools are not businesses. Children are not products. Knowledge is not a commodity, and parents are not consumers. We need to reject and move away from the neoliberal agenda that says learning is only for earning. It ain't. The second is that we need to pay close attention to the fact that most of the high performers are actually moving in a direction completely opposite from the US. So while we are busy narrowing down the curriculum to focus on only literacy and math, they are actually broadening and deepening the curriculum. While we are regulating teachers and blaming them and certainly prescribing what they ought to do, they are actually focusing on professionalism and teacher autonomy. While we are layering on more and more and more tests, and trust me, no one in the world ever had as many tests as we have. And we actually have now more than ever. They're actually reducing the number of tests. Singapore has definitely done that, and it is not a high-testing society, even though there are certainly key tests that drive things. So, the last lesson, I think, is important to remember when we're talking about high performers like Finland or like Shanghai or like Singapore. Things didn't happen overnight. That they paid attention to the long view and the big picture. That they didn't expect quick results. That they made lots of mistakes. And I'm here to tell you that Singapore made zillions of them, and some of those, some of the impact of those mistakes was actually pretty dire. But they continue to sort of learn and move forward, understanding that what they're doing is not educating for the 21st century. We talk about it as if it's ahead of us. We're in it. We're educating for right now. Really? We should be educating for out there, for the 31st century. That is the work that we should be doing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So I think there's a little time for question and answer, and then I have a teeny little wrap-up. So, yes, please.
Oh, I'm interested in size. Does size have to do with our potential to implement some of these ideas?
So the question is about size and our ability to implement some of these things. Size does matter. No, I had to say it. I had to say it. No, I think that's something that is said about Singapore. Singapore is a small system, but what I would say is that we are a large country, but we have many small bits within, and we can't seem to do it within a district or within a town, or within, I mean, New York City is pretty big, but still, we don't seem to manage getting on the same page and having some compromises and conversations that might possibly, move us forward. So I don't have much to rest, this response on, other than to say, I don't think it's only about size. Yeah. Yes, please.
I'm interested in how Singapore approaches multiculturalism because it's very multi-dimensional. You talked about the PISA test, and I was wondering if there are achievement gaps amongst, like, within different ethnicities and how the teachers and teacher educators tackle these issues.
Right. There are certainly differences in performance. So the question is about achievement gaps, the fact that Singapore is a very multicultural, racial, religious society. So I would say that we don't have the gaps that we have. See, I speak about we in every sentence. I'm a we there, I'm a we here. It's kind of great. So folks are definitely concerned about making sure that achievement is positive and strong, across the country. And in fact, the current focus is definitely on ensuring that schools who may serve students who come from poorer families or who may, be new to the country or what have you, actually get more resources than other countries. So this idea of the rich getting richer is not a policy in Singapore. That what they are very, very invested in is a term that they use all the time, leveling up. So how do you level things up so that everybody, so the playing field is flat? Now, don't get me wrong. There are no easy answers. There's still lots of issues, but it definitely is a conversation that is very much at the forefront in Singapore. Yes, please.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm struck by your introduction of missing.
Mm-hmm.
And at the outset, you presented that 79.7 of the people in the data set were white ethnic. Now, comparing that demographic to the results that we have with students who are predominantly looking like me,
Right.
where are that teaching group and your student group in Singapore? Because what I'm hearing is that 79.8% of the teaching researchers are white ethnic and see the dismal, failure with people of color.
Right.
Why do you choose that population, and how can you compare that to what is going on in Singapore?
Oh, I didn't choose the population. So when we set up the survey, as you're talking about the teacher educators, and close to 80% were white. So we set up the survey, and those are the folks who responded to us. And that gives us an indication of the composition of the teacher education professoriate, which is actually confirmed by demographic data and research that's been done. So our sample actually ended up being representative, but we didn't purposely select them. And the folks we interviewed were also randomly selected, but because the larger sample was representative, the random sample ended up being fairly representative as well. Yeah. Yes, please.
Hi. I have a quick question. You brought up a lot of, well, first of all, thank you.
Thank you.
Second of all, you brought up a lot of really great points. And I have a question. It's kind of twofold, but I'm just going to stick to one.
Okay.
On your last slide, it was, what does it mean to educate human beings for the 31st century? How would you go about in this week talking to American educators about moving the focus from the now or preparing for the now, which is too late, to preparing for this 31st century? Because a lot of the literature either talks about 50 years in the future or 2043 or just prepare for right now as opposed to prepare for a millennium from now. So I didn't hear that part, but I'm sure you had some type of implication or whatever. How can we do that here? Because I think that's very important.
I think that in some ways the answer is both, very, very complex and very simple. We need to prepare thinking human beings. That's basically it. So until, work that I do with teachers, when teachers are saying, I have to use this curriculum, I have to do this, and I have to be on page 20 on Tuesday, there's nothing I can do to make this different. My response is there is one thing that you can do that is actually so impactful but very teeny. Ask one open-ended question. Once a day, ask one open-ended question. So that, first of all, kids get the sense that there actually are questions where there aren't set answers. And the kids who never get it right actually could get it right, because every answer is a possibility. So that's, so in some sense it's simple and not. So I just need a time check, because I know I'm supposed to be like guarding the time. Susan told me she has a plane to catch. So, just so you know, I knew that she was leaving early. Time? 5:57. Okay. In that case, I will close my own talk. So I saved this. Can you tell it's me? So this is me on my first day of kindergarten. And, it's my 5-year-old self. And my mother tells me this story that she didn't want me to be one of those whiny children who are like crying and need their parents to sit with them for 2 months, so they can make the transition. My mother was all into independence, like, get a hold of yourself. So she started to prepare me for school long before school happened. And she'd say things like, better be a good girl. No, you can't go to school. Only good girls can go to school. And of course, I wanted to be a good girl and I wanted to go to school. So she said, on the day that I finally made it to the first day of kindergarten, I grabbed my lunch pail and I started running towards the school door, because I was like, I finally made it. There's no turning back. And in fact, she had said, wait, aren't you going to kiss me goodbye, take a picture? I was like, Mommy, I have to go to school. So I share this picture because I've always been envious of people who seem to have a plan. Those folks who, like, they always knew what they wanted to do from the time they were 2. They have a whole set of goals that they systematically work through. They have some kind of, like, life plan. And I always felt, that I wanted to be like that. But I'm just not that way at all. I kind of meander around and move from opportunity to opportunity, and I say yes to things, and sometimes that gets me into trouble, but most times it's actually pretty good. So obviously I've done okay by myself, but at the same time I worried a little bit, about focus. But when I look at my 5-year-old self, it is clear that I knew then what I'm just kind of slowly realizing now, that at 5, I had a plan. My plan was to be in school with teachers and students. And clearly, that plan has lasted me a lifetime. Thank you. I really want to thank you all so very much. You cannot know, what this means to me. So anyway, there is actually a reception. I bet there's going to be good food, and there certainly will be alcoholic beverages. And it is meeting in 179 Dodge. So please do join us there for some more conversation and fellowship. Thanks again.